The public inquiry into how thousands of haemophiliacs, including a number from Essex, were infected with hepatitis C and HIV during NHS treatment in the 70s and 80s is continuing today. The government has announced it's increasing the amount of financial support being given to people affected by the scandal. Andy Evans was given a contaminated blood transfusion by the NHS when he was 5 years old. He developed hepatitis B and C and HIV, which became AIDS by the time he was 16.
It was a waiting game to die. And for 4 years I struggled in and out of hospital, waiting to die. People were frightened of AIDS, and people were frightened of people who had AIDS. And so there was no telling anybody. This was something that we had to keep completely to ourselves. I was lucky in that I was quite young, if you can put it that way, when I was infected. And I could talk to my parents about it because they already knew. People who were diagnosed when they were older were warned to keep it away from everybody, including their family and their parents. And they had nobody to talk to about it.
Breakfast with Sonia Watson and Ben Fryer. This is BBC Essex.
Now on BBC Essex, let's bring you more on our top story this morning, the current public inquiry into what's been called the worst treatment scandal in the history of the NHS. In the 70s and the 80s, contaminated blood products were used in hospitals, leading to the deaths of nearly 2,500 people, including a number of people here in Essex.
Thousands more were left with serious illnesses like HIV and hepatitis. Yesterday, 2 years after it was announced, hearings began into the public inquiry into what happened. Tony Farrugia lost his dad and two uncles who lived across East London and Essex and joins us this morning. Tony, thank you so much for having a chat with us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on.
And just explain exactly what happened.
Well, our family suffer from a genetic condition called haemophilia, and my father and two of his brothers suffered from this condition. My father was diagnosed with mild haemophilia at 6 months old, and then through to about 1977 he was treated with cryoprecipitate, which was a product taken from one person's blood and then injected into my father, or the product that he required from that blood was given to my father, and it came from just one donor, and it was relatively safe. In 1977, and I know that these products came in before then, but my father was switched with no consultation, no warning, in 1977 to a commercial product that was brought in from America. There were known risks. It came from high-risk donors, drug addicts, sex workers, people that were on the real edge of society. And it was all infected with hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV. So my father contracted hepatitis B on his first infusion of factor VIII in 1977. We also believe at that point he was also infected with hepatitis C, as the majority of people, a medical profession, believed that first infusion of this American product would highly likely lead to the hepatitis C infection, or non-A, non-B as it was called back then. So he was put onto this treatment in 1977. He developed hepatitis B. He also developed an inhibitor immediately to the treatment. His body reacted to the treatment he was being given, but it appears from his medical notes that they just continued to use it, even though he was mild and he didn't need much treatment. When he did go for treatment, they were giving him this product. So we believe that he was also infected with HIV in the latter part of 1981. His health started to deteriorate round about the latter stage of 83. Lots of hospital visits, became very unwell. It was at that point I was removed from the family home and placed eventually into a children's home. I think my father then went on for about a year suffering with HIV, and his health was deteriorating rapidly. and in April 1986 they sectioned him under the Mental Health Act. We never actually saw him again, or his children never saw him again. And then a couple of days after he died in September 86, my twin brother was also removed from the family home and placed into care. The rest of the family were just left to their own devices, two of the brothers being over 18. So we were sort of separated from that time in 1986. We were fully reunited again in 2012, some 26 years later.
Tony, what age were you when you say you were separated from your father and went into care home? What age, if you don't mind me asking, how young were you when that happened?
I was 12. I was 12 years old.
What impact did that have on your childhood?
Well, I didn't actually know that this is what was wrong with Dad. I wasn't told until my 14th birthday. Not on my 14th birthday, but a week after my 14th birthday, my father came to visit me in the children's home up in Bedfordshire, and basically told me this devastating news, that he was HIV positive. And yeah, I think from that point, certainly for me and for a lot of our community, the haemophilia community, this was just starting to come to light. We were dealing with basically death. It was a death sentence. There was no treatment. And at that moment, when he uttered those words of HIV, I knew that was it. So it was devastating, to be told that my father had this virus by my father, and yeah, we knew the outcome. And yeah, pretty much within about 16 months of telling me he was dead. And then we went on to lose other family members. My dad's brother was diagnosed a couple of weeks after my father died. And then my dad's other brother was diagnosed on Christmas Eve, 1990, with hepatitis C, and they've subsequently all passed away. We still have one family member that's survived, a cousin, who was infected with hepatitis C. He's currently at the stage 2 level, has got cirrhosis of the liver, but he's alive. So for us, it's been the best part of 33 years of burying our dead.
And Tony, do you feel that what had happened was all been kept quiet and hush-hushed?
At the time, no, but I actually came back to this 10 years ago on seeing an email from another family member saying to check out this website, and I went onto the website, and it was a website called Tainted Blood. It was set up by haemophiliacs some few years before, and yeah, it was just devastating. I'd always believed that what had happened to my dad was a terrible accident, and it conspires that it wasn't, that the government were aware of the risks. Hopefully this will all come out in the public inquiry. Yes, it's been one big massive cover-up, from the initial infections right through to how the government have dealt with it, from my dad's death. So from 1986, so the best part of 30 years, it's been just like a can being kicked up the street by government, and they come back every now and again, and they just increase these payments, and it's not compensation, it's ex gratia payments. They increase them. Just doing enough just to make it look good. So yeah, we've now got our public inquiry underway, and yeah, we're hopeful that we will get the right result.
So we're talking to Tony Farrugia, who lost his dad and 2 uncles in what's been described as the worst treatment scandal in the history of the NHS, a public inquiry into contaminated blood products being used in hospitals in the 70s and 80s that led to the deaths of nearly 2,500 people is now underway. And Tony, I just want to conclude the discussion this morning by asking you what you hope that inquiry will lead to.
I would hope that the inquiry would lead to some responsibility being, or some liability, that someone is responsible for this happening. Yeah, and justice. Justice. Finally, to get justice for what's been done. I will use the word compensation. I do believe that the victims of this should be compensated for what's been done to them. So yeah, I think compensation is one of the issues. I think another main issue for me is that my father's death was recorded falsely in history as an accident, and it wasn't. That's one thing I'd like put right. And obviously, for everyone still alive and suffering today, that they are properly compensated for the harm that has been done to them. That's what I would hope that we would get from this inquiry. I know that the inquiry can't set levels of compensation, but hopefully it can give us the recommendations that we can then move forward to the next level of this fight, obviously with our legal teams through the courts.
Tony, thank you very much for coming on this morning to talk to us. Tony Farrugia, who lost his dad and two uncles, and they lived across East London and here in Essex. 8:18. Let's bring in Des Collins now, a senior partner at Collins Solicitors, who is representing more than 1,000 victims at that inquiry. Good morning to you, Des.
Good morning.
Did you realise just how big a scandal this was?
No, I first became involved in this as recently as about two odd years ago. And when I first heard about it, my immediate reaction was, as someone who'd lived through the 80s scare and the AIDS scare in the early 80s, that this has long been resolved. I really did literally think, what are these people talking about? It's all been done. It's all been sorted. They've been paid compensation. Why won't they stop moaning? I sat and listened to people like Tony. I sat and listened to a number of the victims, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was so appalling, and it was a story which was never being put forward to the public. I think most people in the public domain took the view that I did, that it was all sorted and we should all move on with our lives. But that wasn't the case, and it's good that we've managed to get the public inquiry underway yesterday.
You heard what Tony wanted the conclusions to be from this inquiry. What do you want to come out of it?
I think what I would like to come out of it would be a full understanding of precisely how successive governments and administrations and departments of health have allowed this to continue. If you took the situation cold to in an interview with the Department of Health or with a Secretary of State for Health, then they would say, no, of course that could never happen. We'd never allow it to happen. So against that background, if everyone would say, no, we would never allow this to happen, how did it happen? Our own view, having worked on this now for 2 odd years, is that very, very quickly after the product which Tony was talking about came onto the market, which is a product called Factor 8, it became apparent that there were problems, that the fact that it was being harvested from Skid Row in America, from cadavers in Russia, was giving rise to problems. And at that point, really very early on, someone should have said, enough is enough. I know we've got it wrong for the last year, but we've got to put it right now. But having got it wrong for the first year or the first 18 months or whatever period it was, no one was prepared to stand up and say, no, we got it wrong, we'll put it right now. Because at that point, the implications of admitting that they got it wrong would have been very serious to the Department of Health. But certainly, 40 years later, they are horrendous for the Department of Health because they've lied. They've covered up, they've lied, they've done absolutely everything they can to avoid this coming out in the public domain. They're going to have to face this now over the next 2 or 3 years of this public inquiry, and they're going to have to admit exactly what they did.
And just tell us, you represent more than 1,000 victims at this inquiry. Just tell us some of the stories that the families have been telling you about how it's affected them. I mean, on the front page of the Eye today, one of the headlines, you've got a year to live and don't tell your family. Some really harrowing stuff coming out of this. What have families been telling you?
What families have been telling me over the past 6 months as we prepared immediately for this inquiry are stories of effectively family disintegration. You start with the father and mother and 2.4 children, etc., living happily in the suburbs of England, the father develops AIDS, and the family goes into free fall because the father can't work. The father and the mother, because the father can't work, start arguing. There are disputes in the family. The children are affected by this. And you see the whole family going into, effectively, disintegration into free fall for a period of 18 years. And that doesn't really stop then, because then you read about, you take a statement from the children, and they say, my parents did what they could, but it was awful. And then when I was trying to do my GCSEs, I couldn't really perform. I couldn't perform. Do you know why I couldn't perform? Because I thought it was all futile. I knew my dad was going to die. He knew he'd been going to die for the last 18, 20 years. And I couldn't see any future. And it's that futility for the next generation, which I find really, really shocking. And that runs across pretty much every family we act for.
Des Collins, thank you for joining us, a senior partner at Collins Solicitors, who are representing more than 1,000 victims at that inquiry. And as he intimated there, that is going to go on for a number of months and will be in the headlines throughout the next few months, you would imagine. Let's get a statement. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, said when the inquiry was announced, the contaminated blood scandal was a tragedy that should never have happened and has caused unimaginable pain and hurt for victims and their families for decades. I know this will be a difficult time for victims and their families, but this inquiry will begin a journey which will be dedicated to getting to the truth of what happened and delivering justice to everyone involved. It's Ben and Sonia on the BBC Essex Breakfast Show at 8:24.